The Mishnah on Daf Lamed Chesed and Beis establishes that the din of a tanur is different than that of a kira, whereas the Mishnah on Daf Lamed Vav and Beis begins with the din that a kira shesikua bekash ubegvava noisen olei tapshil. Whether that means noisen olei tapshil means it has a heter שהייה or a heter וחזרה, but the kira has a kula that where the hesek is using kash and gvava, the din is noisen olei tapshil. In contrast to that, the Mishnah on the Lamed Chesed and Beis establishes that the din of a tanur is mulchama, and the din is that a tanur shesiku b'kashu b'vava lo yitain. The basis of the difference between a kira and a tanur is explained succinctly by the Mishnah in Siman Reish and Gimel, Sifkat and Chaf Aleph, where the Mechaber says that the tanur afilu in kusak the kash ubegvava oser afilu lismoich loy. There in Sifkat and Chaf Aleph, the Mishnah Berurah says, towards the end of Sifkat and Chaf Aleph, the latter part of Sifkat and Chaf Aleph, he says mitoich shektsaros lemala v'rochav lemato, because the structure of a tanur is different than that of a kira. Niklat choymoi l'teichoi tfei mikira lekach yichmiru voy yoiser mi bekira.
Page 73.
The Mechaber goes on to say that the usual din of Goruf and Kotum, which is matir שהייה, also doesn't apply in the case of a tanur. And the Mishnah Berurah says, someone who removes the gecholim from the tanur, it's not possible that there isn't something which can then be fanned into flames. The klal hadvarim being that tanur intensifies, its structure intensifies the heat, and so instances in which there would not be a chashash chitui in regards to a kira, that chashash chitui remains in the case of a tanur. That's the klal advarim, which is mavur in this Mishnah as is paskened, as we just saw in Shulchan Aruch. Tosfos discusses the question as to how Hananya will read this Mishnah. We've had a sugya previously on Daf Vav and Beis through Daf Lamed Chesed in terms of the machlokes Hananya and the Chachamim in the dinim of kira. Tosfos' shaila then is: does the unique chumrah of a tanur impact the din of Hananya? Or do we say that the same way as Hananya is not choishish to chitui once it's yigiyah l'machal ben drusoi, the same would be true in the case of a tanur? So we'll learn Tosfos briefly. Tosfos says, "Tanur shesiku b'kashu gevava lo yitain ila hachzir tanan." In the same way as if in the Mishnah on Daf Lamed Vav and Beis, Hananya's reading of the Mishnah of noisen olei tapshil is lahachzir, not lahashois, because once the tapshil has reached machal ben drusoi, שהייה is mutter. So Tosfos says, "Hachanami hay lo yitain lo yachzir." Tanur is no different than kira, that when the Mishnah says lo yitain, it means exclusively the isser of being machzir, but does not refer to any additional isurim of שהייה, then Hananya would apply to the instance of a kira. Now Tosfos is now going to look for a proof for this din, and Tosfos says, the din of Shia, the din of Hananya applies to a tanur despite the fact that it's not Goruf Kotum. So Tosfos says, "Kidemashma beperek kamo, deshaриnon kidrochaisa uboshel kemachal ben drusoi afilu be'enoi Goruf Kotum umashma hasam de betanur ayri dekoy ahadiktani hasam le'eo loisemali isha kedera asasios." We saw the sugya on Daf Yud Ches on the days in last week's limud, and we focused on the aspect of the chashash megis. And we'll now focus on the next part of that sugya, where the Gemara begins the Shakla Vatari with the brisa of Lo Samali Isha Kader Asosius Turmusim Pnech Letechatanur. Similarly, Lo Yamal Nachtim Chabes Shal Mayim Vaniach Letechatanur. So Taisa says the simple reading of the Gemara is that the subsequent Shakla Vataria is referring back to an instance of being masha in a tan. The Gemara then says, "V'hashta do Omar Mar Gezerah Shema Yechata B'Gcholim." Now that the Gemara has established that even Beis Shammai agrees to this din that Lo Samali Isha Kader Asosius Turmusim, we're not discussing the issue of Shvisas Kelim, of a malacha being carried out on Shabbos. So therefore, the Gemara says, "Hai kidro chaysa shori la'anucha im chashecha b'tanura." A kidro chaysa can be left in the tanur im chashecha, meaning just before shkias hachama. Mai taima kivan doleichazi leursa, since the either way the tavshel will not be ready to be consumed at the night time. Asuche masach daite minei v'loi osi l'chatuya b'gecham. That's the first din which the Gemara infers from the fact that the halacha of Lo Tamali Isha Asosius Turmusin is discussing Chashash Chitui. Hesech Hadas of Kidra Chaisa removes the Chashash of Chitui. So whether, as we touched on in last week's limud, Grufuk Tumo is based on Hesech Hadas, as we saw in the Lashon of the Rambam, or it's based on a Tikkun in the Eish, as we saw in other Rishonim, the reading of the Gemara Mufurish is that Kidra Chaisa is a principle based on Hesech Hadas. Different second tip. The Gemara then goes on a second and says, Uboshil shaperdomi. So too, if the kedera contains something which is completely mevushal, shaperdomi. Similarly, one can be shayet. Boshil viloi boshil oser. If it's only partly mevushal, then it's oser. Meaning, we have either a heter of kidra chaisa, which is hesech hadas, or we have a heter of mevushal called tzarkai, because that doesn't necessitate any chitui. In the middle phase of Boshel v'lei Boshel, the Gemara says that will be awesome. Tosfos, if we now return to the Tosfos on Daf Lamed Ches Beis, has said that these two statements of the Gemara, these two dinim, that Kidra Chaisa would be matir Shehia in a Tana, and so too Boshel would be mutter. Tosfos says both of those prove that the din of Chananya applies identically to a Tanur as it applies to a kira. Now, let's take both those dinim one by one. Kidra Chaisa doesn't seem to be in any way related to the machlokes Chananya and Chacham, like we said. The Gemara establishes a principle that Kidra Chaisa creates a state of Hesach Hadas. That l'chayra is there's no reason to assume that should be subject to the machlokes Chananya and Chacham. Tosfos seems to be saying that if we see that the heter of Kidra Chaisa applies, then we see that the din of Hananya applies to a Tana. Why should that be? Why shouldn't Kidra Chaisa apply to a Tana? Kidra Chaisa implies Hesach Hadas. Is there any reason to assume that shouldn't apply to a Tana? Is there any reason to assume that should be subject to Machlokes Chananya Chacham? What did Tosfos see in this Gemara? That's the first kash on Tosfos. Then Tosfos says, "Uboshel kimachal ben drusoi." The Gemara goes on to say that boshel will also remove the chashash of shema yechata. Tosfos says "Uboshel kimachal ben drusoi." The boshel of that Gemara means not mevushel called tzarkai, but mevushel kimachal ben drusoi. If you look at Rashi on Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis, Rashi says, "What does boshel shaperdomi mean?" Says Rashi, Mevusheles kol tzarka shaperdomi. Meaning, there's nothing in the actual wording of the Gemara that limits boshel to either ma'achal ben drusoi or mevushel kol tzarka. We don't know what boshel means. Rashi seems to be saying that boshel will mean mevushel kol tzarka according to the Chacham. So therefore, we would say that according to Chananya, we don't know. So if we now return to Tosfos, Tosfos is making an assertion that by the Gemara establishing that boshel is mutter, that will mean machal ben drusoi according to Chananya. How do we know that? La'olam, we could say that since a tanur is more chomur, even Hananya will agree that Boshel needs more. Boshel would have to be Boshel called Zarkoi.
Is a heter
In a kira, but not a heter in Tanur. So to now summarize the two kashas we had on Tesis. We've started with a Mishnah that Tanur has a greater chashash chitui than a kira. That's implied by the din of the Mishnah that kasha gvava is not a heter. So too as Paskin Shulchan Aruch Goro for Kotum is not a heter in the case of Tanur. Mishnah Berurah explains that HaRav allows a greater possibility of chitui. Therefore, Tosfos goes on to discuss whether the kulas of Hananya in Kira would apply to Tanur. So Tosfos brings two proofs that Kira and Tanur are analogous. One is from the fact that Kidro Chaisa is a heter by Tanur, and the other is that Boshel implies, according to Hananya, that even Machal ben Drusoi would be considered a basis to remove the Chashash of Chitu. We have two questions. Why shouldn't Kidro Chaisa be a heter by Tanur? Kidro Chaisa is Hesach Hadas. Goref and Kotum. That we can understand the possibility of Chitu may change, but Hesach Hadas absolves the whole issue of Chitu. One. Second, and this kasha we'll see in a moment, is the kasha actually of Rabbi Akiva in the Gilin Hashas. That Tosfos has no right to assume that the term boshel in that Gemara means Machal ben Drusoi any more than it means Mabushel called Tzarkoi. So in the Lashon of the Achreinim, Arvach Tzarech, how does Tosfos himself know that boshel means Machal ben Drusoi, which then gives Tosfos the right to say, so I see that Machal ben Drusoi is a heter even by Tanur. Maybe boshel means Mabushel called Tzarkoi. Let's see briefly the wording of Rabbi Akiva in Gilin Hashas. Kashali said Rabbi Akiva, Hashomloi niskam Machal ben Drusoi. When the Gemara uses the term boshel, the Gemara never defines what that term means. The Gemara never defines what boshel means. Elostamu boshel shapidomi. The Gemara just makes a statement that mavushel is elo. The Tosfos kosvu shom. Rabbi Akiva says Tosfos themselves there on Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis says dahainu k'machal ben Drusoi dahokai melon kechananya. Tosfos himself concedes that the term boshel is undefined. So Tosfos says, according to Hananya, we will then interpret and explain that the term boshel means k'machal ben Drusoi. But there's nothing in the words boshel themselves that say imply machal ben Drusoi more than mavushel called tzarkoi. Meaning, Rabbi Akiva is saying that if the reading of the Gemara would imply that boshel is machal ben Drusoi, then Tosfos wouldn't have to say kechananya. Like Hananya, correct. And in fact, now that you're pointing it out, there's a kasha that the Achreinim ask on Rashi, that Rashi there in Ches Amud Beis that boshel is cold tzarkoi. Yet we find that Rashi in two places also paskins like Hananya. Shittas Rashi is also like Hananya. Rashi Daf Lamed Dal, Rashi Daf Lamed Zayin. It's a kasha that Achreinim ask. So where did Rashi have the right to say that boshel dafki means mavushel called tzarkoi? Again, it should be dependent on the machlokes Hananya and the Chacham. He says, "V'imkein ich osu kan hoichacham izeh dilma be'emes tanur chomer." Perhaps like Tosfos is grappling with this question, if Tanur is Mochomer, perhaps it is. The Kimachal ben Drusoi also ude amrinanu boshel shapridomi, that which the Gemara concludes that boshel removes the chashash of chitui hainu kipshuto yu boshel legamrei. That's the essential kasha of Rabbi Akiva. So we have two kashas on Tosfos. What did Tosfos see from Kidro Chaisa? That should be irrespective of Tanur and Kira. And how did Tosfos have a right to assume that boshel has to be understood like Hananya, that it's Kimachal ben Drusoi? Like you were saying, Tosfos paskins like Hananya, so Tosfos has to explain that boshel is consistent with Hananya. Not that it has to be like that, so therefore there's no proof. So to the answer to this question, l'chura, is we find in the words of the Tosfos Yishanim Afanat. And in fact, if one looks in the Tosfos Rosh, it's even more mafurish that this is what Tosfos means. That the Tosfos Yishanim is mechadish chidush nifla, which clearly is a machlokes harishonim, and that is that Tosfos Yishanim explains, and we'll show in a moment that that's just Tosfos also, that the heter of Kidro Chaisa is only true according to Hananya. The Rabbanon don't have the heter of Kidro Chaisa. Now this is obviously the loika halacha. Shulchan Aruch is mefurish in Siman Reishon and Gimel that Kidro Chaisa is a heter. It's mefurish. When
This is the opposite of our days.
We'll see. Let's see in a moment. So the Mechaber clearly says in the beginning of Reish and Gimel that there are two heterim according to the Chachamim to allow Shehiyah. One is Mavushal called Tzarkai and Mitztamik Viraloi, and second, Oishehu Chai Shalom is Bashal Kla. So Tosfos Shita is Mufurish that Kidro Chaisa is a heter even according to Rabbah. But the Tosfos Yishanim says, V'imas nisin lahashlis tanan. If the Mishnah is like the Rabbanon, then the Tanur Nami also lahashlis. Then Tanur also has the same Isser of Shehiyah. Now the Tosfos Yishanim asks a kasha. He says, Afal gab de Kidro Chaisa le'el shari. Meaning, what's the Tosfos Yishanim asking? He said, I've just established that Tanur also has the identical Isurim of Shehiyah lefi the Rabbanon than Kira has. Now, that l'chayr is pashut because Tanur is obviously more chomer than Kira. The Tosfos Yishanim is clearly setting up his kasha. He's saying, but I have a Gemara connected that. The Gemara is Mata Kidro Chaisa. Now, when we see this Tosfos Yishanim again, it's Dvarim Tmuim. What does the Tosfos Yishanim find in Kidro Chaisa that contradicts saying that Tanur won't allow Shehiyah according to the Chachamim? Pella. Kidro Chaisa is Hesach Hadas. Loime boy according to the Rishonim that Gorf and Kotum is not to do with Hesach Hadas. So Gorf and Kotum doesn't apply to a Tanur, but Hesach Hadas may well apply to a Tanur. There's no connection between the two. And even according to the Rambam, clearly the degree of Hesach Hadas that there is in the case of Gorf and Kotum is different than the degree of Hesach Hadas by Kidro Chaisa. So not just do we have now a kasha on Tosfos, but Adarabah, we see that the Tosfos Yishanim has made a hanocha in Svara that Kidro Chaisa shouldn't be consistent with Lahashis. Zok the Tosfos Yishanim eino chanani hahu kechananya. The Gemara that says that in Tanur Kidro Chaisa is mutter is only according to Chananya. And eino chanani. And Masnisin ila Hashis Tanan, I said the like Chananya. The Chananya, the Mishnah doesn't allow the heter, is not Chananya.
Tyson Yisham, she taught some, and all the sugis go to Chananya. So
Ches is Chananya. Yeah. Before explaining the Tosfos Yishanim in Svara, let's just go back to the Tosfos for a moment and show that this is Shitas HaTosfos also, to show that the Tosfos Yishanim can be consistent with Tosfos. We now have a very straightforward way to read the Tosfos. Let's go back to Rabbi Kiva Eiger's second kasha. We'll recall that Tosfos brings two proofs that Tanur allows the kulas of Chananya. One from Kidro Chaisa, two from Boshel, which means Kimachal ben Drusoi. Let's focus on the second proof, that Boshel means Kimachal ben Drusoi in that Gemara. Who said that Boshel means Machal ben Drusoi? Boshel is an undefined term. Let it mean a Boshel called Tzarkai. And La'olam, even according to Chananya, Tanur will require a Boshel called Tzarkai. According to the Tosfos Yishanim, Tosfos is a sequence. Tosfos is saying like this. If we see that the Gemara says that Kidro Chaisa is a heter by Tanur, so therefore the Gemara must be going according to Chananya, because the Tosfos Yishanim has told us that Lefi Rabbanon, Kidro Chaisa is never a heter. So Tosfos says now the two statements of the Gemara are consistent. The Gemara said Kidro Chaisa is mutter. So who is the Gemara speaking according to? Chananya. So when the Gemara goes on to say that Boshel is also mutter, what's the chiddush of the Gemara? No Boshel called Tzarkai. The chiddush of the Gemara is now we again have the heter of Chananya. Oy bazoi, the interpretation of Boshel is Machal ben Drusoi. And you say that one came out often in Tosfos Rosh. So then the Siddur Hadvarim in Tosfos is simply following the sequence of the Gemara. The Gemara made two statements, Kidro Chaisa and Boshel. So Tosfos Kidro Chaisa means that the Gemara is discussing Chananya, which like Reb Shlomo said before, is consistent with Shitas HaTosfos, that the stoma of the Sukkot should follow Chananya. Tosfos, once then we're using an undefined term of Boshel, we're saying a Chiddush Aliba de Chananya. So Tosfos, it's very reasonable to assume that the term of Boshel is Chananya's definition of Boshel. Kiddush Chaisa doesn't matter. So this will be the Teichen Beis Hashem of the So the question that's now asked is clearly we now have to explain the kasha that we've been struggling with is why is the Tosfos Yishanim clearly saying that Kidro Chaisa should only be a heter according to Rabban? Kipshuto Hesach Hadas is a new svara, irrespective of the discussion of Hanania and the Chachamim, if Grufa V'Ktuma helps by the Tavshil that's only Kimach Ben Yisrael. And this Be'ez Hashem will be the token of what we will try now to get.
And the Rambam clearly doesn't learn this way.
Correct. And we'll see. Now, again, to recall, Lehalacha, we have Mefurish and Shulchan Aruch that Kiddur Chaisa is a heter even according to the Chachamim. Mefurish and Shulchan Aruch, we require Grufa V'Ktuma is a heter until Mitztamik V'Raloi and Mevushal Kol Tzarkai, and so too Kiddur Chaisa is a heter. We are coming to be maimed the shita of the Teis and Teis Yishanim. However, Be'ezer Hashem, using the understanding that we'll gain in the Teis and Teis Yishanim, we will then establish Be'ezer Hashem a yisoid in Chashash Chitui, which will then be applicable even according to the Paiskim, and we'll have seed coming off Kiminis Lahalacha Be'ezer Hashem. Okay. What we will suggest as a hesber in the Teis Yishanim is by first introducing a fundamental kasha problem with the heter of Hesach Hadas as it applies to Kiddur Chaisa. What's the heter of Kiddur Chaisa? Let's go back to the Lashon of the Gemara. The Lashon of the Gemara was that since it will not be Shori lanucha and chashecha ma'itayim okima delay chozi la'orisa asuche masach daita minei v'loy osi lechatuyeh b'gechalim. Now, einochem nami, there's no chashash chitui. Close to the zman of the Shehiyah, he won't be mechata balayla, but why isn't there a chashash that tomorrow morning will be mechata? The imtim tzaloyma that's a vaita chashash. There's a case in Shulchan Aruch which discusses this mefurish. Towards the end of summation, we have a case in Sif Daled, where we have a case. Oh, Sif Gimel, I apologize. Hamashkim baboiker, v'rosh gedicha tavshiloi. He sees that the tavshil is nitztanim. So too, we have a Ramah, which we'll see in a moment, towards the end of summation, Gimel, that discusses a case of a kedera and nitztanim. In the Metzias Hadvarim, there's no reason to assume that the same way as there may be an issue of a kedera that's been placed much earlier of Shabbos to be ready balayla, that will have to be mechatet somuch l'suda. There's no reason to assume that there won't be a chashash chitui somuch l'suda bayayim. Ma'anaf gemina. Kiddur Chaisa just means it needs the entire layla to be mizbashal. So after that time, it may require a chitui in order to bring it to Gemara Bishula. The same way as balayla, something that takes less will require a chitui to Gemara Bishula. So this kasha, which I'm not aware of a clear marmokim in Achreinim that discusses the Shaila Lehedya, but the din of Kiddur Chaisa needs a basic beer. Why is there no possibility of a chashash chitui lamacha? Why is that? Do we seem to see that the chashash chitui is only somehow that somuch to the Shia Balayla, he'll be mechate, but not lamacha?
HaRav, the stoma is using the chanin for the lunch suda. So therefore, he could try to be b'mar b'shulei in the morning to get.
So to get it for the roi for the suda then. This is.
What is he need? Suda. So what else did he possibly?
He's not being mashal l'motzi Shabbos. That we know is the Ramah that be'etzem likra din is mutter. So that's a basic koshi that underlies the entire din of Kiddur Chaisa. Why is there no chashash chitui l'macha? So we could say, make a cheshbon, and say einochenami. Tosfos therefore held that's why Kiddur Chaisa only applies as a heter according to Chananya. Because to be choishesh that it won't reach machal ben drusoi by the morning, that we're not choishesh. That's very right. So therefore, what would be possibly anticipating would be occurring in the case of a Kiddur Chaisa. It would be shoya kol halayla, and lemochar it would not yet be either Gemara Bishula. It would still be mitztamik v'yafela.
It would be after 100% cooked, but not yet.
Or not yet mitztamik. Either one. Either yet it wouldn't be Gemara Bishula. Either 90 or 100 would mitztamik v'yafela. All each rishon l'shitosai. Memele zok the Teis Yishanim and Tosfos a very simple cheshbon. The heter of kidro chayso can only be true according to Hananya. It's mukhrach. Because as we asked, fundamentally, there's no difference between the chashash chitui leil Shabbos than the chashash chitui Shabbos in the free. What's the difference? Elomai, the only thing that kidro chayso accomplishes is that because it's not going to be chazila arsa, you won't be mechatit balayla. So therefore, the whole issue of chashash chitui only begins in the morning. In the morning, it's not mistaber that it won't alch upon and be machal ben drisoy. That much, yes. So therefore, the heter of kidro chayso be'echrach is only true according to Hananya. This would be the underlying premise that the Teisus Yishanim and the Teisus Rosh make. And therefore, the Teisus Yishanim, without any explanation, makes a simple statement. And he says, Kidro Chayso is only true if you Hananya. The Arsach, there's no Chitui. The Mochar will assume it's Machal ben Drisoy. So the Chashash will only be Chitui from Machal ben Drisoy until either Mevushal called Tzarkoi or Mitztamek V'Yofaloi or even Mitztamek V'Raloi in the three sheets Rishonim in this Nidan. So Memela, Teisus Yishanim makes a very simple statement that in Svara it's Mukhrach, that the din of Kidro Chayso can only be true according to Hananya. So therefore, going back to the Teisus then says, if I show you that Kidro Chayso is true in the case of Tanur, that itself implies that once it reaches Machal ben Drisoy, there's no Chashash Chitui. Nifla. Let's review this one more time. We first said that the answer to Rabbi Kiva Eiger's question, that how can Teisus make a statement and say that Boshel in Tanur means Machal ben Drisoy? Maybe Boshel even according to Hananya means Mavushel called Sarkoi. So we said, no, since the Braisa is according to Hananya, and because the din is that we see Kidro Chayso, so Teisus says, therefore, the Chiddush is Aliba de Hananya, and therefore it's reasonable to assume that it means Machal ben Drisoy, but it's not Mukhrach. Rikvegi can still say, maybe not. Maybe the Braisa is saying Kidro Chayso applies, but not Machal ben Drisoy. But according to the way we're explaining now, that every Kidro Chayso reduces to a case of it being Kemachal ben Drisoy on Shabbos morning. So if the heter of Kidro Chayso applies according to Hananya, that's Mukhrach, that even in a case of a Tanur, beyond Machal ben Drisoy, there's no Chashash, Yechata. So Teisus is Niflakim in Chaymer. It's not just that Teisus says it's reasonable to assume that since the Braisa is speaking according to Hananya, because Kidro Chayso is a heter, so it's reasonable therefore to assume that Boshel will mean a Hananya term of Boshel, which is an assumption. And Rabbi Kiva can still say, you can't prove it. Maybe not. Maybe Boshel means just Boshel, it's called Tzarkoi. But according to the cheshbon that we're suggesting, that every Kidro Chayso has in it this kasha. Now, why isn't there a Chashash Chitui l'machar? So therefore, every Kidro Chayso we're saying from the perspective of the Teisus Yishanim is a case where by Shabbos Shachris it will be Kemachal ben Drisoy. So therefore, every heter of Kidro Chayso is based on Hananya. So if Kidro Chayso is a matir in the case of a Tanur, that means essentially what we've allowed to do is we've allowed a Shehiyah with the possibility that Shabbos in the morning, the bishul won't have proceeded as quickly as we intended, and it will only have reached Machal ben Drisoy. And at that point, what removes the Chashash Chitui is only if you hold like Hananya. But we see there then Mufurish in the din of Kidro Chayso that once it's reached Machal ben Drisoy, it's a heter, even according to Hananya, in a Tanur.
Actually, Hananya, we should give explains that by Tanur.
Yeah.
Maybe Hananya would be more by a Tanur, that by him it's also not good.
Correct. And that's why we said that we, based on the first initial mahalach that we took in Teisus, we can't yet prove the answer to Rabbi Kiva's kasha. But now, based on what we're saying, that every Kidro Chayso becomes a case of Machal ben Drisoy, Shabbos in the free, so therefore we implied in every heter of Kidro Chayso is that once it reaches Machal ben Drisoy, there's no problem, even by a Tanur. Even by a Tanur. The cheshbon is Mavur B'tech Divrei Teisus, and l'chera we've now suggested a possible mahalach, not just to explain why Kidro Chayso is according to Hananya, and therefore Teisus has a right to say that Mavushal is referring to Machal ben Drisoy, but we've actually proven it because every Kidro Chayso reduces to a case of Machal ben Drisoy Shabbos morning, or the chashash of that. So we've proved the answer to Rabbi Kiva's kasha possible. Yesh lo ben b'kushas Rabbi Kiva. So that's
his state of mind or his intent B'shas he puts it in before Shabbos, is irrelevant. It doesn't matter.
L'chayra, the hesach hadas is only that he's not going to be mechata la'arsa. That's all we can infer from the Gemara. Since it won't be ready la'arsa, he won't be mechata then. But what will happen Shabbos morning? Now, like you said, the tafshil needs to be ready. Now we're reverting to a case of what is the standard case of Shiur Leil Shabbos. What the normal case would be.
It's on the fact 12 hours.
Right.
Repeat the question.
Yes, right. What you're saying is perhaps we're not choshesh at all to that remote possibility. I mean, even though in Shulchan Aruch we're discussing the possibility, we're not choshesh to that. We're not choshesh to that at all.
Because it's always going to be cooked.
Correct. Right. Correct. Right.
The Gemara has a heter of keder chayasa.
No. So he's saying because
It has to apply to something.
no. So what he's saying is that the heter of kidro chaysa means that enuchanami, there is always the possibility that of chitui in Shabbos in the morning, but that possibility is so remote because it's on the time. Remember, we're not choishish to that tier of the Sif and Shulchan Aruch.
The Rambam and Taisa.
In what way?
Because it's dependent on.
Right. So let me explain what Reb Shlomo is answering. I think I'm being mechaven l'daitoi, and I'll just explain what he means. We'll recall that Tosfos draws a parallel, which is our initial problem, between Kidro Chaysa and the heterim of Grufa and Ketuma or Ma'achal ben Drusoi. And we asked, what has the Hesach Hadas din of Kidro Chaysa? How can that serve as a proof to the dinim of Ma'achal ben Drusoi or Garuf and Kotum, which has not to do with Hesach Hadas b'Pashtos, right? What we've now said based on this mahalach is that every Kidro Chaysa requires two heterim, Hesach Hadas for the night and the heter for morning. If we say, if we posit the way you're suggesting, that there is never an issue of Shema Yechata in Kidro Chaysa, then we lost the Tosfos again. Do you see what I'm saying? So you're right. The other Rishonim, how they will answer the Tosfos Shana Shaila, we have your teretz. But in Tosfos, we are going to have to say that in every Kidro Chaysa lies also a Chashash of Shema Yechata. Two tracks. So let's summarize. The Iker Chidush, which we want to arrive at in the sheet of the Tosfos and Tosfos Yishanim, is that in every Kidro Chaysa we require two heterim. We require for the Laila the heter of Hesach Hadas, and for what will proceed from the morning, where there's a possibility of it only being K'machal ben Drusoi, there we will again have to resort to standard, so to speak, heterim that remove the chashash of chitui. So then Tosfos then created an exact parallel. If Kidro Chaysa is a heter, we're not speaking about the heter of Kidro Chaysa of Nasiach Das. We're speaking about the heter of Kidro Chaysa once it reaches Ma'achal ben Drusoi l'machar, which is only true of Kuntachanana. So it's the same thing by Bosch. But you're right. In the other Rishonim, we can answer what you're saying, that perhaps they never consider that possibility at all. And we'll come back to that later. So, Ad Kan, we have the structure and the beer of Tosfos and Tosfos Yishanim. But just to repeat and summarize, the Chidush is that Kidro Chaysa always has to anticipate two possibilities of Chitui. Chitui through the night, which has a Chadas, removes that Chashash, and the chashash of chitui l'mochar once it reaches mitzamek v'yofaloi, which Hananya removes. Now the shaila is what it takes away that chashash chitui, according to the Rav Rishonim and the way we saw is Paskins in Shulchan Aruch. How, according to those Rishonim, do we remove the chashash chitui l'mochar? So we had one suggestion that Chachamim b'chai gavna weren't choshesh at all. The possibility of after the whole Laila being ala ish, that then the mochar it should be, we're not choshesh for, even though the Shulchan Aruch discusses such cases. That was ma'aseh shahaya kachaya, and it could happen, but the chashash chachamim weren't choshesh to. That may be a very valid mahalach. What we want to use this shaila that we are forced to consider as a shaila, lefi the Tosfos and Tosfos Yishanim. What is with the issue of chashash chitui in b'shachris in the morning? We then want to discuss this shaila ba'ofen kloli in dinei שהייה. Are we to infer from those Rishonim that don't seem to reckon with the kasha of the Tosfos and Tosfos Yishanim that the chashash of שהייה is only if the chashash chitui will follow immediately from the ma'aseh שהייה or close to it? But Luya Tsuya, the Maisa Shia will be at one time, and the Chashash Chitui only could be later, and could only be later. In that case, we're not Choshesh for Chitui at all. In other words, is there a fundamental machlokes here between the Tosfos and the Tosfos Yishanim? Again, that's not to negate other svaras that may, remove the shaila, but given that the Tosfos and Tosfos Yishanim have forced us to consider that every instance of the heter of Kidro Chaisa has hesach hadas for the laila, and still anticipates a chashash chitui b'shachris, which Hananya takes care of, and that's the whole basis of the Tosfos and Tosfos Yishanim, that the heter of Kidro Chaisa is only according to Hananya. The other Rishonim who don't even have this assumption and don't really even seem to anticipate this as a chiddush, but just merely assume that Kidro Chaisa is even according to Hananya. But my nechleku. Is it, as was suggested, a specific machlokes in Kidro Chaisa that perhaps we're not choshesh to that remote possibility of lamachar? In which case, the machlokes, the basis of the machlokes between Tosfos Yishanim and Tosfos on the one hand, and Rov Rishonim on the other, is were chachamim choshesh with the possibility of it not being mavushal al kaponim kol tzarka. Could possibly say that. What we'll try and see if we can examine is where in the dinim of Shehiyah do we see a nidoin as to whether the chashash of chitui has to be in some way following the ma'aseh Shehiyah, or is there even a chashash of chitui where the ma'aseh Shehiyah can be at one time, and the only possibility of chitui is a lot later, which means there's a time period in between in which there is no chashash chitui. Does that then remove the chashash of chitui?
I want for tonight.
Yeah.
So I want for tonight. I'm scared I'm going to be chata now.
Yes.
Here, but this tonight is out.
Okay.
It's only tomorrow.
Right.
It's two different cases.
I understand, but why don't I have a chashash chitui for tomorrow?
Maybe I do.
Right. So, but clearly, and if we do have that chashash chitui, then that would force us to say that Kidro Chaisa is only true according to Hananya, but Rov Rishonim hold not like that. How are we answering that shaila? That's our question. How are we answering that question? So, let's first discuss this in Svara, since we began in Svara. What would be the reason to say this way or that way in Svara, in terms of what we know in the sugya of Shema Yechate? What would be a reason to say that chitui has to follow from the Shehiyah, or that chitui can be distinct from the ma'aseh Shehiyah? What would be the need in here?
In the morning, it really is hadas.
Right.
Basically, it has hadas.
Correct. But what? And in the morning, let's say we.
At night, it's not hadas. I just got out of the kitchen.
Oh.
My head is still in the kitchen.
So
But in the morning,
The suggestion was that it's directly related to the probability of Hespedas. That was the suggestion.
No. That's fine, and that svara may be correct. But let's give the dinner hagdara, a working hagdara, and then we'll try and add the svara that you're saying. We would possibly say that the reason why there's a chashash of Shema Yechate following the Shehiyah isn't that the chashash chitui begins, so to speak, Leil Shabbos. The yesod advarim is that since, like you said, you're already being oisek in the cooking, so therefore the chitui is just continuing what would be the normal act of bishul. Like the housewife stirs the kedera as the bishul proceeds. So since the kedera has been aloish from Erev Shabbos, which is the Shas Heter bishul, the chashash is that without chitui, the Shehiyah will simply continue as chitui. It's not that Chachamim will mechadish an entirely new chashash chitui that perhaps will be mechata. Chashash chitui is directly related to what the tafshil is Erev Shabbos. Since the tafshil is in the process of being nizbashal, chitui is part of ensuring that the tafshil continues to be
More
nizbashal.
than that, the bishul process never stops.
Okay, we could say sharpa, simply a hemshech of the bishul. The yesod of Goruf and Kotum either removes the chashash of chitui, or the Rambam creates a hesach hadas. But the yesod is that we have to see chitui as just being a continuation of the shir. To use your expression, haven't left the kitchen. Therefore, we could see a very simple svara that b'mokum that there is a period of hesach hadas in the interim. It's not that the hesach hadas removes chashash chitui, and therefore the chashash chitui doesn't return. What the hesach hadas in between establishes is that now the involvement in the bishul has ended. Chachamim were never choishesh stam that the person will approach his tanur and see a bishul in progress, become concerned and be mechata. That was never the chashash. The chashash was that a shehiyah will progress into a chitui, or that the bishul in the Shleima's words will naturally proceed by means of a chitui. But there was never a chashash that someone will walk over to a tavshil and see that it needs attention and be mechata. This was a chashash. The chashash always was that shehiyah can't be followed, or could always be, since it could be followed by a chitui, so we need something to avoid the shehiyah proceeding into a chitui.
And I'm going to be chayshish, I'm going to be mechata somebody else's tafshil.
Right. I'm not. Right. But in terms of the hemshech hadvarim, what the klal that we were establishing is, and we could hear that as being a very clear svar, that the chashash chitui always has to follow a shehiyah. When the kedera is in a state of being nisha, it means the bishul is proceeding. So therefore, there's a chashash of chitui. The same as we saw, there's a chashash of megis according to some rishonim. The rishonim said that bishul doesn't necessitate hagasa, as we discussed last week from the Ramban. Chashash chitui is a natural part of the tavshil, but once the hesach hadas is accomplished, we can't then anticipate a new period of possibly examining the tavshil and see that it requires a chitui. Chachamim were never choishesh to a chitui that's not part of the progression of the bishul. That's a svara we could. In which case, Shana may be chaylik, and that would be the yisoda machlekes. You say no. The chashash chitui is wherever the tavshil requires chitui. Chachamim choishesh you mechata. Machlekes be yisoid in how to understand the chashash of shema yechata. Is chashash shema yechata a function of the continuation of a shiui, the bishul being in progress, to use your phrase, that he never left the kitchen? Or do we say that no, the chashash of chitui is irrespective of whether or not it's preceded by a shia? Simply the fact that the kedera is there and one may need to ready it creates a chashash of chitui. So the etzem yisoid hadvarim, that chashash chitui is somehow dependent on its proximity to the ma'aseh shia. So that yisoid hadvarim we see in the Tehillah LeDavid, Siman Reish and Gimel, and Siman Reish and Gimel is Gimel. Now, to be makdim the din of the Tehillah LeDavid. The Tehillah LeDavid is discussing a Mogen Avram, and the Mogen Avram is referring to the din of the Ramah, which is actually discussing the din not of Shehiyah Erev Shabbos, but of placing the Kedera on the Tanur on Shabbos, which is called by the Pesachim Chazar. Now, the Ramah says that there was a widespread practice that what would be done is that the Kedera would be left mutmon in a tanur. Now, if it would be left Shabbos morning longer in the tanur, the tavshil would be overcooked. So what did they do? The tavshil was removed from the tanur. It was then left to cool. Where was it left to cool? It was left to cool on top of what's called the tanur of the Beis HaChorev, which is the furnace that heated the home. Later, on Shabbos morning, the shtifcha, the goya, would come and she would light a fire not in order to cook the tavshil, but in order to warm the house. Now, in the halachas of Amir La'akum, that's mutter, because of the principle of hakol chelam et tzaltzina, frigid conditions, we needed heat. It's common practice, more in the Rishonim, many shaylos that were discussed based around this mitzvah, that the shifcha would be madlik, the eish, in the tanur of the Beis HaChorev. Now, the issue is that besides the fact that she's been mavir and eish for heating purposes, which is completely mutter, and that's not really germane to the discussion. The issue is that the kedera is on the tanur. So we have two issues. We have an issue of bishul, and we have an issue of chazara, which means the goy has now put a tavshil effectively on a tanur. And the same way as a Yisrael can't take a tavshil that has been removed from the eish without the conditions of chazara, put it on an eish on Shabbos. So the Ramah says, whatever you're not allowed to do, you can't tell a goy to do chazara either. So we have two problems here. We have bishul and we have the issue of chazara. So zok the Ramon, nonetheless, that was the minhag. Noyagim she'enim Yehudim moitziim hakaderes min hatanurim moishivim etzel tanur beis hachorev umevaeres hashifcha achar kach hatanur ahu v'al yidei zeh hakaderes choyzim v'nirtachim. That heats them up again. This is not hasugya, but the reason why this is mutter is because it's considered that any bishul or chazara is an unintended consequence of the act of the shifcha to heat up the furnace, to fire the furnace. Her intention is to provide heat for the house.
Put the text and till over back, if you don't mind. Yeah.
So the other consequence is that through that the tavshil is heated and possibly nizbashal is called a psik reisha, and a mir la'akum and a psik reisha were made. Adkan the teichen hadvarim of the Ramah. Now, the Ramah says, "Aval al yidei Yisrael oser b'chai gavna." A yid can't do that. He can't take out the kedeir from the tanner, put it on top of the beis hachorev, and wait until the shifcha comes and lights it. What did he do wrong? So the Mishnah Berurah says it's a bishul issue. He put the kedeira on the, and Mishnah Berurah says, he says, "Oser b'chai gavna," says the Mishnah Berurah, "Soloima lo hoishiv hakadeira tzatana beis hachorev." The Havele, because this is a case of echad noisin es hakadeira ve'echad ha'esh.
Even though it's not lit.
The Harishon Potter Avalosser, there's an Issa D'Rabbanon of putting something where eventually it will be cooked. So that's why it's also for the Eini Yehudi. What?
No, it's all.
No, by now it's cool. So either it's not mavushal called sarkoi, or it's a lach that was nitstanim. I apologize. I wasn't going to discuss the details of the Issa Bishul. We're anticipating the Issa Bishul now. On that, Ramah, the Magen Avraham, has a discussion. What would be in the case that you're asking, where there's no issue of Bishul? The Kedeira is still Reseach, and it's mavushal called sarkoi, and it's not mitztamik for Yofaloi. We have no issue of Bishul whatsoever. Could the Yisrael then, in that case, put it on the Eish, and the Eini Yehudi later, the Shifcha will then light the fire? Could he do it or not? What's it in? Zog the Magen Avraham in Sivkot and Mem. So the Magen Avraham says, Mashma miloshin Ramah. From the fact that the Ramah says that it's always osir for a Yisrael to do that, it doesn't seem to give any lenience or any case where it would be mutter. The afilu litain olav koydem hesek osir. Even if the Yisrael would put it before it had been, obviously if it's already musak, there's a chazara issue besides the bishul issue. But even if we take care of the bishul issue, and we take care of the chazara issue because there's no fire now, zot the Ramah, zot the Magen Avraham, why? Kiven de lebasoif yir besoichoy eish. Gazrinon shemo yechate begicholim. We're choishesh that even though he may be doing it now, but once the eish gets in the tanur, he'll be mechate, then he'll go back to check it. And he'll be mechate the Yisrael. Gazrinon is the Ramah. The Ramah that says, the Ramah's lashon is, he says, "Abal al yidei Yisrael oser b'chai gavna." So steht in the Ramah. It's based on a Trumas Hadeshen. Zot the Magen Avraham. This is simply the chashash mechat again. This is sheer. Leave aside the issues of is there an isser of chazara before you put it before the ish is there or not. Leave aside chazara. This is sheer. This is simple chashash Hashem mechat.
Yeah, but it's only Shashem Yechat in a safe age level. So,
but what do we see? We see that even though now the Shehiyah itself is mutter, and there's no Chashash Yechata now, and there's no indication that makes any difference how many hours are going to pass before he could come late at night and see that it's time, that the tanner is overheated, it's time to take out the tavshel, and she's only going to heat the tanner well into the morning. Zot the Magen Avraham, there's a chashash that you'll be mechata. L'chayr we see kipshuto in the Magen Avraham that even if we remove the chashash of bishul, placing something in a situation where later there will be eish and later there will be a chashash chitui,
still
chitui. Begoizer, as I stated in Ramah, according to the Magen Avraham, the afilu litin olav koydem hesek aser kiven de labasayv yeh b'seich keish gajin Hashem yichata b'gichala. Now, although this is not directly our inyan, it's important just to anticipate this kasha. Let's ask a simple kasha, Rabbi say. If this is aser, So how could the guy do it? What did we say? We said it's an unintended consequence that later the Ish will go on and be mavashal. Because her intention is what? Her intention is. But now we're saying that the Yisrael can't do it because it's also thing because of Shia. Didn't we have a call in the Ramah that whatever the Yisrael can't do because of Shia, he can't tell a guy to do either? He's telling the guy to do a Ma'aseh Shia. If the Yisrael himself did it, what would be the Isser? Shema Yechate. Classic Shia. Chiddush, that it's only going to happen later, but it's a classic Shia. Zot the Magen Avraham Klal, whatever you can't do, Kol Adina Manal, Shia, Hazara, whatever it might be, you can't tell a guy to do. What am I? What's the Shikha doing? She's putting something on a tanner in a situation. There's a Chashash Chita. How is it mutter? It's a Kushia, two more the Magen Avraham. This Kasha, just touch on it. The Shulchan Aruch HaRav in Kunshas Achron. Rishon Gimel Sivkot Yud Aleph asks this Shaila.
Let's chaz this over again. What's the Kasha?
Just to repeat the Kasha again. To quote the Lashon of the Ramah. The Ramah begins the introduction to the end of Sifhei by saying, Kol hadvarim she'asal asoisam b'dvarim elu. All of what's nichal in the Gezeres of Chachamim in Simmeration and Gimel. Zot the Mishnah Berurah and Sivkot and Tzadik Daled. Hainu afilu dvarim she'en behem rak issa derabanan. Chashash chitui, whatever it may be. Zot the Ramah osir loyma le'eni Yehudi lasos. You can't tell a guy to do it. Lochein osir loyma le'eni Yehudi lohochem akter. Standard bishul. You can't tell him to do Shia. You can't tell him to do Chazar. What's the Magen Avraham now telling us? That case where the guy is putting the kederis on top of the Beis HaChorev, where eventually a fire will be lit, is also for the year to do. Why? Chashash Shema Yechate. So how could the guy do it? We said an unintended consequence is the heter of it, but the actual act itself is also. Until now, our perspective has been the guy is going to light it the heter because hakol chelam etzatzina. It's going to be nizbashel. That's all psik reisha. It's all psik reisha. But the actual placing of the kedera in the first place, well before the tanner is ever lit, is a problem. So how could the Ramah bring from the Chumas Desh and the minig was that the Goya took them out to the tanner, put them on, and later came and lit the fire? The Yisrael himself can't do that. So just to say a teretz nifla that Shulchan Aruch HaRav says, I'll just touch on it briefly. He says, since there's even a heter according to the Chumas Desh, for the Goy to be mavashel, unintendedly, but the Goy will be mavashel. How could we be machmir for the goy Shema Yechate if the goy could be mavashel? What's happening? Luyat Suyah was nitstanim, and the goy put it on the ish. What would happen? It would be bishul. So the Trumas Hadeshin, unintended consequence. So if it comes out that al yidei the goy putting it on the tanner, we're actually allowing the goy to be mavashel. We can't be machmir on the Shema Yechate more than the actual bishul what the goy is going to do. True, but what's the klal? The klal is what is the Shema Yechate for me cannot be because the goy is doing a ma'aseh iser. How can it be that the goy will be restricted by a Shema Yechate if in that act he's actually allowed to be mavashel? We can't carry over and say that the goy becomes my Shema Yechate. If the goy himself can be mavashel, the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, what svara does it have? I want just to touch on that zisa svara that the Shulchan Aruch HaRav says, just to simply explain that side of the Magen Avraham. Halacha l'maaseh, the Magen Avraham says that the minig is to be mekel. He says, "Umi ha'olam noyagim heter b'zeh." Klal Yisrael was noyag heter to take a kedera out, put it on the Beis HaChorev as long as there's no issue of bishul. The goiter came later on, and she was masik, and there's no problem of Shema Yechate. Zot the Tilo David. Why? The reason why there's no chashash Shema Yechate is because the chitu is not samach to the shia. Ba'oifen that the Tilo David is showing us that our suffix is a Magen Avraham. It's two tzaddim. Klal Yisrael can I get the diuk in the Ramah? Minig ha'olam is Klal Yisrael's minig is the loike the mashma from the lashon of the Ramah. Zod the Tilo David. The reason why is he says Efsher atam kiven the ozad dayin ein chashash Shema Yechate avdi yesh chashash Shema Yechate acher tach lo yibuyin on heker. It's more kal. So the etzem yesod hadvarim we find in the din of the in the Magen Avraham. Could one place something ala ish today just to emphasize in a kuda halacha l'maisa? Will we have time to return to the Chazon Ish? No, time to turn. What about very common shaila today? One wants to be put a kedera on top of an electric range, which will be turned on with a timer. Is that the same as what the Magen Avraham says, that Nagu Oilam, to place a kedera on top of the tavshil that the goiter will cook? Mali that I'm anticipating that she'll heat the house because of Hakol Chayla Metzaltzino, which is perfectly mutter. And Magen Avraham says, we're not Cheshish to Shem Yechata later. There's no issue of Shia, no issue of Chazara. So, we have a very basic eitzah to take something out of the fridge on Shabbos morning that's Mushal Kol Tzarkoi. Avoid the whole issue of Garf and Cotton because there's no Chashash Shem Yechata. Simply have an electric element, put it on a Shabbos clock. Put it up the night before, and 6 o'clock in the morning, the timer will go on. It seems to be a very straightforward eitzah. Mali if it's going to be the shechah, Mali if it's going to be the Mali if it's going to be the timer. The theme minig Yisrael, which the Magen Avraham brings, not like it's meduktik in the Durik in their Amah.
Lahakol.
You see, we should be able to be makel. We have a very simple eitzah. Chashash chitu there isn't, because like the Tilo David explained, there's a hefresh in Zman between the Shia and the Chitu.
There's no chash chitu when the timer turns it on.
That as the Tilo David says, is unrelated to the time I put it there.
There's a hefsek.
I'll put it there at 12 o'clock at night before at the end of the Suda Shabbos. 6 o'clock in the morning, the timer will go on. Very simple eitzah. Oh, well, what's a chiluk you're suggesting?
No, because by the timer, but the guy who assumed that the guy is going to like.
Yes.
By the time you put it into motion before Shabbos, it's going to happen. This is not the guy.
Yes. Well, because you're saying by a guy, there's no chazaka shliach shlichusay. She could be nisatzel. Yeah.
The suggestion was that a timer is more reliable than a guy.
Yes. Good.
No.
So you were mechavin to the Chazon Ish. If you look on page 110 in the Chazon Ish at the very end of Sivkot and Chafalus.
Let's go pick up the Chazon. There we go.
So it's on page 110, second column, almost at the end of the column, Dibra Maschel Vihine.
The last paragraph, right? Go down, please.
Vihine. If he places the kedera on the eish.
You went too far.
Koydem shahusa katanur. Have a gamken kemashe betchila b'Shabbos.
It is
Shia. Lomadnu. We learn from this. In soif eish lovei lahatanur. If eventually the tanur will get heated, kimoy mechoina chashmalis, like with an electric device. Shehechin me'erev Shabbos lovei b'shal ploinus. He set it that the current should begin to flow at a certain time and thus heat the oven. Also, you cannot put it in the tanner. Afilu tavshash abishal kol tzarkoi, va'afilu hucham ukedin isachazara. The choshev kemashhe b'Shabbos. This is Shehia. You are setting up a situation of chashash chitui. Zok the Chazon Ish, either are more with a goy, va'afilu ibet tanner shemasik hanochri loy choshev mashe hosom mechuser ma'aseh shel bal b'chira. It's Chazon Ish seems to be saying, I'm sorry, two svaras. One is it's mechuser ma'aseh, it's not automatic, it's not automated, and it's a bal b'chira. It needs an intended act. Aval hocha the soifchem lovoi me'atzmoi near the choshev mashe. So the Chazon Ish, it's considered a shia. Just to touch on this briefly, and it's not obviously anidin, but this is unfortunately a common shaila. Happens in Lakewood in the summer often. Leil Shabbos, there'll be a blackout, and then the tanner will go back on. Is that considered a new Shehia on Shabbos?
It happened here.
It was off the Eish, and now you placed it on the Eish. It's now automatically placed on the Eish. Shia is even Memela, as we're going to see in the Chazon Ish, and then the Eish came. Is that like a guy? It needs the mice.
But it was also unanticipated
to fix the line, right? It's also unanticipated. Yesh logam. So Rabbi said just to place the mokum for the shaila comes directly from very basic Yesodis. The Ramah's Lashon is it's also for a guy to place it on a tanner kodim. Magen Avraham discusses what about the Yisrael. Simple diktuk of the Ramah, as the Chazon Ish says, means that's Shehia. There's a chashash chitu even subsequent to the placing, and the minig Yisrael is to be mekel. Now, where does this become very relevant? And here, and with this Be'ez Hashem will finish, we come to a fundamental yesod in Shehia, miteirosoi of the Chazon Ish. And this is how we're using the Tesis Yishonim to arrive, as you can see, at a very basic Hagdara of Shia. The Bir Halacha discusses that why is the Ramah making such a firm statement that any Shehiyah or Chazara that's Osar Alidei Yisrael is Osar Alidei Akum. We know that there's a principle that Shvus to Shvus b'Makom Mitzvah is Mutter. And many poskim hold that Oinig Shabbos is considered a mitzvah, which is Mata Shvus to Shvus. It's much more more later on with Yain being brought there. Carmelis. Kama Makomis in the poskim, Oinig Shabbos we consider a mitzvah b'Negea to Shvus to Shvus. Amir La'akum to do an Issa D'Rabban. So effectively, why shouldn't there be a makom to be makel to tell the guy to do a shia chazar in order that we should be able to have a Shabbos? We're not just talking about that. We want it piping hot, maybe an edible.
A classical shus to shus makom mitzvah.
This is the kasha of the Chazon Ish. Now the emes, the Bir Halacha says that in the Chanami that there are achreinim that are makel that the makom tzayrich you can be makel. As they bring the Bir Halacha from Kama Achreinim, the Bir Halacha begins in Sifei, the very first words of Sifei in Lahochem Akadeira, in the Ramah in Sifei Lahochem Akadeira, where the Bir Halacha discusses this shayla. But Zot the Chazon Ish, the Ramah, who in other places seems to be makel on Shvus to Shvus Makom Menik Shabbos, doesn't seem to be makel over here. Why? Zot the Chazon Ish, and we'll just see, we have time to see watching the Chazon Ish inside the how we have time. Zot the Chazon Ish, if you go back to that same Chazon Ish, higher in the column, Dibur Maschel Venire, very fundamental yesod of the Chazon Ish. Venire das haramo lesar kanamir lenochri v'loidomi l'shvus t'shvus b'makom mitzvah d'matir mikedi isa semen shin zayin sefei.
Where's the reference?
Dibur Maschel Venire, that same column, Dibur Maschel Venire, yeah, that's correct. There,
Here, okay.
yeah, so Venire, yeah, the second column that's been highlighted. So he says why? He says because. The Dover Yovesh, if you just go down one line, the Dover Yovesh of Tav Shulchan, even if there's no issue of Bishul, the Noisin al Gabi Kiroi Toichoi Somuchla Be'echad Meifana Ma'asurim, Lo Shaykh Lahatir Mishum Shvus T'Shvus. The whole principle of Shvus T'Shvus is irrelevant here. Why? The Ein Ha'Isser HaNesina. Chachamim didn't say the act of placing something on a tanner is Osir. Elo Mitzius Matzav Zeh Osru Chacham. When Chachamim Asad Shema Yechate, they were describing an Isser which accompanies a default state of a Kedera remaining on a Tanner. The Chachamim didn't place an Isser on the act of placing the Kedera on the Tanner. It's a Kedera being on a Tanner engenders a Chashash Chitui. Zot the Chazon Ish, a Yesod Nifla, the heter of Shvus to Shvus is where the Torah asked the Yisrael to do a certain Maisa, the Chomer of Shvus. Then, if he tells that a goy to carry out the Maisa, we have the Kul of Shvus to Shvus. But Shehi has nothing to do with the act of placing it on the Tanur. It's the being on the Tanur which generates the Chashash of Chitui. Zog the Chazon Ish, even if a koif would place it on a Tanur, it would just land there. As long as that situation of the Kedera being on the Tanner would be relevant to the Yisrael, there's a Chashash of Shema Yechate. This is the Yisrael. This is the Yisrael of the Chazon Ish. Mimele, he says, "V'arezeh b'chlal ha'gzeira, im yamed ba'atzmoi la'yedei nochri, v'afilu hem b'nochri ha'koyiv chayiv lahasir, k'moi kedera boshel v'loi boshel, ha'imedes me'erev Shabbos mishekidesh hayom chayiv lahasira, ha'chenam heicha da'osru chacham chazara, v'noisen la'yedei nochri gora minosan koyiv, she'arezeh noisen mamish, umali b'yodayim, umali ha'yedei groma didei." So Zot the Chazon Ish, this is the Yesod of the Ramah. Why the Ramah didn't anticipate Bichlal why Shvus to Shvus. So if that's true, let's just first take that Yesod of the Chazon Ish. Then l'chayra that will be mavur that the Chashash of Chitui has nothing to do with the juxtaposition to the placing on the Tan. There's no bishul in progress here. The whole svara that we said is wrong. We said that the reason why the Tila David said that the reason why the Chal Yisrael is makel is because Chashash of the placing has to be samach to the Chashash of Chitui. It's not true. The Chashash of Chitui has nothing to do with you placing it. A koif may have put it, like the Chazon Ish says, it could have been put on the Tanur hours before, or a koif put it. You didn't even know about it. What's then the Chashash? like the Chazon Ish says clearly, the matzav of it being aloish is the chashash. So then it should be irrelevant how samach one is to the other. Right? The whole svar of the Tila David should be abgefragt, gefi the Chazon Ish.
Let's finish, if you don't mind.
Correct. That's exactly what it's following on. But the way the Chazon Ish Pashas is proving from the Ramah. We lost the svara. So there is a possible makom to be mifalpel based on the hemshech of the Chazon Ish that the Chazon Ish does concede that every Shia me'erev Shabbos is somehow linked to the eventual Chitul. The reason why, in the case of the Goya, there's an issue of placing it on the Tanur for a later Chashash Chitul is because since you're anticipating it, in your mind, one is samach to the other.
You're not Masech Das.
You're not Masech Das. And there's a mock to Mefato. But Homnias, the point at which we'll pause is that
Problem is he brings the timer in. He brings the timer in.
Right? Which he
Doesn't work.
considers Shia.
He
considers Shia.
Right.
So l'chari yesh lodum tuva, if this suffix is based on the two stadim the Tilra David, and void based on the Chazon Ish. So the Maskonas Hadvarim, the Yesod HaMachloikes between places Yishanim and other places may well be talui on this nidin as to whether if the chitui is distinct from the shia, does that involve a chashash of chitui or not? We're saying the svara l'chara ledina is in Tilul David al pi the Magen Avraham and yesh lodun b'dai toishel ha'chazon ish.
Beautiful.
So just to conclude very briefly with Divrei Haggadah, we find a davar pele in the Tur in Hilchos Rosh Chodesh at the end of Siman Tov Chav Ches. When the Torah goes through all the kviyasin of the moyadim, which our luach has dechiyos for, like loy adu roish and loy badu pesach. So the Torah adds a very enigmatic klal, and he says, "Ula oilam biyoim shehiya Purim." On the day that Purim will be, yeh lag ba'omer. What's the siman? Peleg chai. Pirush Purim lamed gimel chai be'iyah. As they state in Torah. Yes. Sorry. Peleg Chai. Peleg Chai is a loshon of the pasuk, the reverse of the pasuk. Vayichi Peleg. Peleg was one of the bonim of Aver, who was a ben of Shem. Just very big tzara to explain one nekuda in Pashteit in this tour. The Sforno explains that what happened Bimei Peleg was that Bimei Peleg, he says, Lashon of Peleg is Lashon Chatzi.
Lashon?
Chatzi, it's halving. It says if one looks at the lifespan, the longevity of those before Peleg and after Peleg, it's close to approximately became halved after his time. Zok the Sforno, and it's Barichos and Hakdom of the Sforno to the Pirush of Chumash. That the reason is because after the chit of the Dara Floga, which is biyom of niflaga haaretz, pasuk says in Perek Yud. Zok the Sforno, that niflaga haaretz means the aretz was no longer safa achas of bar machadim. There was no longer a unified sense of the Rebbeinu Shalom's presence in the bria. Yerushalmi Megillah says that safa achas and bar machadim means lashon hakodesh. After each lashon was niflag, it means they became more distant. There was less intense manifestation of kedusha in the bria, and therefore longevity decreased. That we know that consistently in the bria, the energy in the bria, the intensity of the bria, even in the physical realm, became constantly attenuated, was because the bria became consistently distant as the svarim from the Rebbeinu Shalom. Biyom of niflaga haaretz. The Tur, there are two moyadim, two zmanim, where Klal Yisrael also was distant from the Rebbeinu Shalom in a way that the Rebbeinu Shalom's hashgacha seemingly wasn't manifest. And though there are two moyadim which counter that, one of them is Purim, simple. The Rebbeinu Shalom was Yoshin, Nisyashu, and Agula, Shivim Shana, and like Achashverosh said, I'll make the cheshbon vanila yeta, and yes, but loyeta, and yemne v'loyeta. Purim came to counter that. But the Rebbeinu Shalom was manifest. Zok the Tur, the same thing is true in Lag BaOmer. Lag BaOmer also comes to counteract an intense hester. which means leaving aside all the inyanim that came afterwards of Rabbi Seina Mekubalim, of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, and the Gili of Seidat, speaking about Rishonim. The Rishonim call Shavuos, they call Lag BaOmer Proisatzes.
Safe.
The Rishonim call Lag BaOmer Proisatzes. Chamisha Osar Yoim before Atzes is Lag BaOmer. The Torah says that from Pesach until Proisatzes, that means until Chamisha Osar Yoim Kaidim. Proisat Zeres is Lashon the Mishnah Bechiris when you get to Gerin Lamaisa. Shloisha Gronos Lamaisa, one of them is Proisat Zeres. What does Proisat Zeres mean? Takes the Mor of Shemesh in Pashas Emor. He says Proisat Zeres means that we now are already in the period in which we are enjoying the oir and the giluyim and the darga that Chag HaShavuos will give us. He says there's two phases. Until Lag BaOmer, we're constantly distancing ourselves from the oyer of Chag HaPesach. Now we get to boost a little in Pesach Sheni, where there's Tarim Psichin, but we're constantly distancing from Chag HaPesach. Like we discussed last week, in the Yemei Iyar, we enter into Yemei Din, into Yemei Hester. Not Re'iyah anymore, but Shmiya, like we said from the Zera Kodesh. Once we reach Lag BaOmer, says Mar Shemesh, that turns. We're now already in the anticipatory period of Chag HaShavuos. Memele, the Rishonim who argue, did they stop being mace on Shavuos, or did they stop being mace on Lag BaOmer? It's really the same shita. Shavuos ended the Misa of Tamid Rebbe Kiva. Did it end literally on Shavuos, or did it end on the period in which we enter the boundaries of Shavuos, in which it's Proisat Zeres? It's Kimat Mavura like that Mefurish in the Beiseis B'Shem the Rishonim in Simatov Tzadagim. Memele, Lag BaOmer represents a transition from the Hester and the darkness, the loss of the clarity of Pesach, to beginning to see the clarity of Yom Matan Torah. Mimelesh, just like Purim reverses in an intensity of Hester and is Megala again Hashgachosoi, the Yom of Lag BaOmer, which is Chal BaOisoi Yom, also begins the reversal of the loss of the Behirus of Pesach and reinstates the Behirus of Yom Matan Torah. Because like we said last week from the Shemi Shmuel, based on Avnei Nezer, Limud HaTorah is the way in which we understand and see and connect to the Hashgacha of the Rebbeinu Shalom in the Bria. It tells us what the Rotzen of the Rebbeinu Shalom is in the Bria. The essence of Lag BaOmer is because we then anticipate the Gilui of the Oyer of Torah of the Yom HaTzeres. Of course, we understand from that, and Rav Shemesh says, that therefore the Gilui of Soid HaTorah is related to that Yom. And that's all that the Mekubalim taught us about the pneumistic significance of Lag BaOmer in terms of the Gilui of the Oyer of Soid HaTorah and Rav Shimon ben Yochai. But what we have, Mefurish and Terosim Shal Rishonim, Api Pashtan Shal Dvarim, it's Mefurish in the Lashon of the Beiseis in the Torah in Simatov Tzadagim, that what the classification of the Yom of Lag BaOmer is Proisat Zeres. The Yom in which we begin to reverse the din of the Yemei HaOmer and approach the Oyer of the Yomim of the Yemei HaTzeres. Therefore, says the Mor of Shemesh, that Avodah in the Yemei HaOmer switches. Until Lag BaOmer, it's Be'ikar Tikkun HaRa. From Lag BaOmer and on, it's Yisod and Malchus, where we begin to use all the Avodah that we've built during the Yemei HaSfira, and we begin the final anticipation of Kabbalah Satayr. That's the significance of the Yom of Lag BaOmer.
Therefore, Reb Shimon would want us to learn Torah as much as possible.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yeshakaya, Rabbi Sai.
I'm sorry about the echo. That's what happens here. If the Rav go on mute.